What if the greatest royal scandal of the decade wasn't whispered by tabloids, wasn't fueled by online conspiracy theorists, and wasn't even sparked by Meghan Markle's critics, but instead came directly from the king himself? What if the most explosive question the monarchy has tried to bury for years wasn't about race, wasn't about protocol, wasn't about titles, but about something far more fundamental, something that shakes the very roots of the line of succession? And what if the answer to that question, the one the palace hoped the world would never ask, led King Charles to make a decision so irreversible, so cold, so brutally final that Meghan Markle is reportedly in fury unlike anything we've seen since Megxit? Before we go any further, ask yourself, what would it take for a king to delete his own grandson from the royal bloodline? What level of doubt, what level of evidence, what level of royal panic would have to exist behind closed doors for Charles to even consider something so extreme? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the questions palace insiders say have been circulating privately for months, intensifying behind draped curtains, behind locked doors, behind closed meetings where only the most senior royals and a handful of advisors are allowed to enter. And the thing no one expected, not even the Sussex's harshest critics, is that Charles has reportedly reopened an issue the royal family pretended to bury years ago. An issue the public was told to ignore. An issue that Meghan and Harry insisted was off-limits, unquestionable, unassailable. But now, because of new legal pressures, new succession concerns, and details that were allegedly inconsistently documented, the king has done the one thing Meghan never expected. He reopened the file about Archie's birth. Just pause on that for a second. Why would a monarch, the head of the Church of England, the symbolic father of the nation, and the grandfather of Archie Harrison, Mountbatten-Windsor, revisit something as personal and sensitive as the circumstances of a child's birth? Is it paranoia, political pressure, a legal requirement, or something deeper, darker, and much more destabilizing? Something that would make even a king lose sleep? And this is where the Real story begins. Not in California, not at Frogmore Cottage, not even during the Oprah interview, but in the palace corridors where private questions began to resurface the moment Charles took the throne. Because something changed when the Queen died. Something fundamental. For the first time in his life, Charles wasn't just the heir. He was the monarch, the ultimate authority on succession, the man responsible for the legal and historical accuracy of the royal bloodline. And with the weight of the crown came responsibilities no one outside the system truly understands. Responsibilities that force a monarch to look at truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or politically explosive. Imagine the moment Charles received the sealed packet from the archives. Imagine the chill that goes through a king when he sees a document he hoped he'd never have to read again. Imagine the questions racing through his mind as he scans the contents. Dates, correspondences, protocols, medical inconsistencies, reports that don't match the official timeline. And imagine the realization that, if left untouched, these inconsistencies could one day ignite a full-blown succession crisis. And if you think the monarchy would risk that, think again. This isn't about personal feelings between Charles and Harry. It isn't about Meghan's relationship with the royal family. It isn't about public opinion or online debates. This is about lineage, legitimacy, the survival of the monarchy itself. Every royal child must meet strict criteria for their place in the line of succession to be undeniable, unquestionable, and legally protected. And if anything at all, raises doubt, the crown must act. Whether that decision is painful or politically catastrophic doesn't matter. Duty overrides emotion. History overrides personal preference. And the king's oath overrides family loyalty. So when insiders say Charles made a decision Meghan will never forgive, they're talking about a decision rooted in centuries-old law, reinforced by parliamentary expectations, and shaped by the king's obligation to preserve the integrity of the succession line for generations to come. But here's the twist. What if this decision was triggered by questions the palace hoped would fade? Questions about the pregnancy. Questions about the medical documentation. Questions about the timeline of Archie's birth. Questions dismissed publicly, yet documented privately. And here's something else you should consider. If the palace had zero doubts, if everything had been clean, consistent, transparent, and properly documented, Charles would have had no reason, absolutely none, to reopen anything. So why now? Why after years of silence? Why after Meghan and Harry left? Why after the Oprah interview? Why after all the public fallout? Because something happened. Something behind the scenes. Something that forced the king's hand. And insiders say Meghan's reaction to learning about Charles's private inquiry was volcanic. Not frustrated. Not annoyed. Furious. The kind of fury that led to frantic phone calls, emergency PR mobilization, and what one aide described as Meghan's most explosive outburst since the day she learned her HRH was officially gone. But was this reaction just emotional, or was it fear? Fear of what Charles found. Fear of what might now be required. Fear of a decision that could permanently erase Archie's royal status. Not symbolically, not socially, but legally? Before we go deeper, consider the timing. King Charles has been tightening the institution, streamlining it, reinforcing rules, removing loose ends, acting firmly on matters the Queen, out of sentiment or age, allowed to linger. He restored clarity to titles. He enforced structure on working royals. He redefined royal roles. And one of his core missions, advisors say, has been to stabilize the future of the monarchy for the next century. Stability and ambiguity cannot coexist. Not in a monarchy. So ask yourself, what ambiguity existed around Archie? What questions refused to go away, no matter how aggressively they were mocked or dismissed? What inconsistencies made Charles take an action Meghan never thought the palace would dare? Because sources say this wasn't a casual review. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't gossip. This was an official examination with lawyers, constitutional experts, and archival staff involved. A review rooted in law, not emotion. And what it revealed, or what Charles believed it revealed, triggered what insiders now call the fatal decision. A decision that reportedly leaves Archie with no future inside the crown. A decision Meghan cannot overturn. A decision Harry may not have the power to challenge. A decision that could, according to multiple insiders, alter the royal family for decades. And here's the part that no one outside the palace was supposed to know. The contents of the sealed report Charles reviewed were never meant for public eyes. They were supposed to be buried forever. But the moment Charles opened that file, the moment he signed an order for review, the moment he involved legal advisors, the decision became unavoidable. So the real question now is simple. What exactly did Charles see? What detail was so disturbing, so concerning, so legally problematic that he took the unprecedented step of erasing his own grandson from the succession line? Could it be tied to Meghan's pregnancy timeline? Could it be tied to medical documentation the palace never fully explained? Or could it be something even more unexpected, something buried deeper than anyone suspected? And if this is only the beginning, what happens next? Because as insiders warn, the fallout hasn't even started. And what Meghan allegedly did the moment she learned about Charles's move is the part no one saw coming. I will continue the introduction in the next segment. What do you think a person does when their entire narrative, their entire public image, their entire story is suddenly threatened by the one institution they spent years fighting and the one man whose approval they believe they didn't need anymore? Do they stay quiet? Do they negotiate? Do they panic? Or do they strike before the truth fully surfaces? Because according to insiders, Meghan didn't just react, she detonated. And the moment she realized King Charles had reopened the sealed file about Archie's birth, something shifted in her completely. Something raw, something primal, something that made aides whisper that they had never seen her like this before. Think about that. Meghan Markle, who has faced press storms, public criticism, family strain, internal royal hostility, and global controversies, allegedly reached a breaking point not during the Oprah interview, not during the Netflix documentary, not during the Spotify fallout, but right here, the moment she realized Charles wasn't playing anymore. Isn't that telling? Isn't it strange how someone who always seemed composed under pressure suddenly lost control at this moment specifically? Why this moment? Why this trigger? Why this level of panic? What was she afraid of? You have to ask yourself, what does Meghan know that the public doesn't? What details did she fear Charles rediscovered? Why would anyone be terrified of a simple procedural review, unless the review could reveal something catastrophic? Something that wouldn't just embarrass her, but obliterate the entire foundation of her royal story. And here's where everything tightens. Because insiders say Meghan immediately went into crisis mode, and not the PR-friendly version her team pushes online. This wasn't a measured, strategic response. This was frantic, emotional, chaotic. Something in her snapped into high alert because she understood exactly what it meant for a monarch to question royal lineage. Charles wasn't asking casual questions. He wasn't gossiping. He wasn't speculating. He was investigating. And that single word changes everything. Investigating means documentation must match. Investigating means medical details must align. Investigating means witnesses must support the timeline. Investigating means the crown is preparing itself for an unprecedented, irreversible ruling. So picture this. Meghan is in Montecito, believing she has moved past the monarchy, believing she has built a life where she controls the narrative, believing she is safe from royal scrutiny. And suddenly she is told that King Charles has ordered a review, an official review, into the legitimacy of her son's succession rights. Can you imagine that moment? The shock, the fury, the fear, the feeling of a past she thought was buried dragging itself back to the surface? Let's be honest. Meghan has been accused of many things, but she has always been strategic, always prepared, always calculating her next move. But this situation, this was different. This was a direct threat to the one thing she could use to tether herself permanently to royal history: Archie's position in the line of succession. Without that, what remains? Titles she no longer holds? A marriage strained by distance and disagreements? A public image shaped by controversy rather than admiration? Meghan understood immediately. Losing Archie's place meant losing the last major piece of royal leverage she possessed. That is why insiders claim she exploded. Not because Charles questioned her personally, but because he questioned her narrative, her influence, her legacy. And in Hollywood, in politics, in royalty, legacy is everything. Isn't it fascinating how someone who publicly insists she doesn't care about titles, hierarchy, or royal status reportedly reacted with such intense anger the moment those very things were threatened? But here's where the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Meghan and Harry have spent years saying they don't want their children involved with the monarchy. They moved to America. They renounced royal duties. They complained nonstop about the institution. They insisted they wanted privacy, freedom, independence. So why does this particular decision, the removal of Archie from a monarchy they claim they want nothing to do with, allegedly trigger a meltdown? It's contradictory. It's revealing. And it raises the question: did Meghan ever truly want to leave the monarchy, or did she want to reshape it with herself at the center? This moment forces us to reconsider everything. Because if Meghan truly didn't care about the crown, Charles's decision shouldn't matter. But it mattered enough to send shockwaves through the Sussex household. It mattered enough for Meghan to make phone calls described as scorchingly angry. It mattered enough for aides to step back and avoid the room. It mattered enough for Harry to reportedly raise his voice for the first time in months. That detail alone speaks volumes. When Harry raises his voice, something serious is happening. But the real twist is this. Sources say Meghan immediately understood that if Charles reopened the file, he must have found something, or someone, who pushed him to act. And the fear wasn't just about the review, but about what else Charles might uncover while reopening it. Because when the Crown investigates one detail, it tends to unravel 5 more. And according to one insider, Meghan said the words that stunned everyone around her. He knows. What does he know? What detail was she referring to? A timeline? A discrepancy? A document? A missing signature? A medical form with inconsistencies? You don't say he knows unless there is something to know. Something you believed would stay hidden. Something you believed would remain unchallenged. Something you believed could never be reopened. And suddenly, the atmosphere in California shifted. Not publicly, not on social media, but privately, behind doors that have seen far more conflict than the public realizes. Harry reportedly went silent, pacing. Meghan allegedly started making calls to allies, strategists, lawyers, all at once. Her voice carried through the hallway, one aide claimed. Her tone was described as urgent. Her words were described as desperate. The phrase she reportedly repeated over and over: he can't do this. But he can. He's the king. And in matters of succession, Only the sovereign has the authority to order reviews, revisions, or removals. So why did Meghan believe Charles couldn't do it? Why did she think she could stop him? Why did she react as if this was a violation rather than a legal responsibility? And more importantly, what was she afraid he would find? Because here's a detail that will shock you. Insiders say this review didn't begin with Charles. It began with someone else. Someone inside the palace who raised a concern Charles couldn't ignore. Someone with access to details no outsider would ever see. Someone who allegedly approached the king privately, bringing information that required immediate attention. Imagine how explosive that must have been. Who would risk their career to bring such a claim forward? A medical official? A senior aide? A longtime royal staff member? And what exactly did they present? Here's where things deepen. Charles didn't act alone. He quietly assembled a small legal team, a constitutional advisor, and 2 archival specialists. 3 meetings were held. No public record exists, but insiders say these meetings were intense, somber, and alarming. Why alarming? Because the inconsistencies weren't minor. They weren't clerical errors. They weren't simple misunderstandings. They were the kind of discrepancies that escalate instantly when connected to a royal birth. Think about it. A normal birth record inconsistency might be a typo, a missing middle name, a wrong date. But this involved questions about physical presence, attendance logs, procedural documentation, private communications between departments, things that should match perfectly but didn't, things that raise eyebrows when the birth belongs to a child in line to the throne. And once Charles started reading, he couldn't stop. The deeper he went, the more questions surfaced. The more questions surfaced, the more pressure mounted. And the more pressure mounted, the more inevitable the decision became. This is why Meghan panicked. Not because of a symbolic gesture, not because Charles was being petty, but because this was serious. Serious enough for the king to take a step no monarch in modern history has taken, to question the legitimacy of a royal birth. That is why Meghan's reaction was instant. That is why Harry's silence was deafening. That is why aides looked terrified. Because once the king begins this process, there is only one possible outcome: the truth. And Meghan allegedly knew that the truth, whatever truth Charles now believes, would lead him to do something she never thought he would dare. Remove Archie from the succession line. Not temporarily, not symbolically, not politically, legally, permanently, forever. And that's where the royal explosion begins. Because Meghan wasn't just afraid of losing Archie's position. She was afraid of what the world would assume once that removal became public. What narrative would form? What conclusion people would reach? What stories would resurface? What doubts would reignite? What questions the palace might no longer be willing to protect? The removal doesn't just erase a title, it implies something. Something unspoken. Something irreversible. Something that can never be undone. And Meghan knew it. That was the moment she reportedly made a decision of her own. A decision just as explosive, just as irreversible, just as dangerous. Because if Charles was going to expose his truth, she was prepared to expose hers. But what she did next is the moment no one saw coming. But before we dive into what Meghan did next, let me ask you something. What kind of secret forces a person into immediate retaliation? What kind of hidden truth pushes someone to act before they even think? What kind of information is so dangerous, so volatile, that Meghan reportedly decided she had to counterattack before Charles could move forward? Because according to insiders, Meghan didn't pause. She didn't breathe. She didn't wait for clarification. She didn't ask what the king discovered or what the review concluded. Instead, she launched into a frantic, calculated, high-stakes maneuver designed to put maximum pressure on the monarchy and to warn Charles that if he dared to push her, she would push back harder. And what was her weapon? Information. The one currency Meghan knows the palace fears more than anything. Not money. Not titles. Not public opinions. Information. But before she used it, there's something crucial we need to understand. Something that sets the entire stage for the war that comes later. Meghan didn't always operate like this. In the beginning, back in 2018 and 2019, she was navigating a world she didn't fully understand, struggling to adjust to the rigid rules, battling the press, fighting for a voice. But now she knows the system. She knows the power structures. She knows where the pressure points are. She knows how to weaponize timing, headlines, public sympathy, and silence. And more importantly, she knows exactly what the palace fears exposing. So when Charles reopened Archie's birth file, Meghan saw it as an attack, not a procedural review, not a legal obligation, not a monarch fulfilling his duty, but a personal betrayal. And in her mind, betrayal requires retaliation. This is where the contradictions grow even sharper. Meghan has spent years publicly insisting she wants nothing to do with royal life. She's told interviewers she didn't care about titles. She's claimed she didn't know or understand the line of succession. She's painted the monarchy as oppressive, cold, dysfunctional, and irrelevant. So shouldn't she be relieved that her son would no longer be tied to it? Shouldn't she welcome independence? Shouldn't she celebrate that her children could grow up free from royal scrutiny? But that's not how she reacted. Because public branding is one thing, private ambition is another. And the private ambition, the one insiders whisper about, was always anchored in one idea: Archie's royal identity. If Meghan wanted to build an empire in America, if she wanted influence, access, deals, visibility, global attention, there was no stronger foundation than being the mother of a royal child with a place in the succession line. That identity wasn't just symbolic. It was marketable. It was powerful. It was permanent. She might reject the monarchy, but the monarchy gave her a unique kind of celebrity status no Hollywood role, no Netflix series, no philanthropy platform, no podcast could ever match. So Charles removing Archie wasn't just a legal action. It was an economic threat, a branding threat, a visibility threat, and a legacy threat. That's why Meghan reacted fast, faster than anyone expected. And according to insiders, the very first thing she did was reach out to her PR advisors with a chilling instruction: we need to get ahead of this. Get ahead of what? No one on her team knew. They didn't know what Charles discovered. They didn't know what decision he made. They didn't know what the review uncovered. But the fact that Meghan was already planning damage control before any announcement was made one advisor deeply uncomfortable. Why are we preparing a counter-narrative? They asked. If we don't even know what we're responding to? Meghan allegedly didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because, as one aide reportedly said, she wasn't responding to Charles's decision. She was responding to what she feared that decision revealed. And that fear is the deepest clue we have that something isn't right. Something Meghan believed Charles could expose by removing Archie from the line of succession. But while Meghan went into defense mode, Harry reacted in the opposite way. According to sources, he went strangely quiet. Not angry, not panicked, not explosive, just quiet. The kind of quiet that unsettles those around him. The quiet of someone who knows something is coming and can't stop it. The quiet of someone who feels powerless. The quiet of someone torn between two worlds, his father's and his wife's. This reaction is important because Harry is emotional by nature. He's reactive. He's expressive. But this time, he wasn't any of those things. He was resigned. He was tired. He was, according to an insider, a man who felt the walls closing in. Why? What does Harry know that we don't? What has he been carrying? What truth has he been suppressing? What burden has he been forced to shoulder? These questions matter, because the next part of the story begins with a moment that reportedly shocked Meghan more than anything else that day. Harry walked out of the room. Quietly, slowly, without raising his voice, without grabbing his phone, without looking back. Just walked out. And Meghan froze. People who know the Sussex household say Meghan can handle conflict, criticism, confrontation, but what she cannot handle is silence. Silence is dangerous. Silence is revealing. Silence means someone is thinking instead of reacting. And thinking is the last thing Meghan wanted Harry to do right now. Because if Harry thought too deeply about Charles reopening the file, he might start connecting dots she didn't want him connecting. So while Meghan stormed, strategized, called people, paced, argued, Harry slipped into another room, closed the door, and didn't come out for over an hour. What was he thinking? Was he remembering something? Was he weighing loyalty against truth? Was he thinking about his role as a father, a husband, a prince? Or was he thinking about the consequences of something that happened long before Charles ever opened that sealed packet? This is where experts on royal psychology say something key. Harry has a pattern of shutting down when internal conflict overwhelms him. He did it after Diana died. He did it during military transitions. He did it during major arguments with William. He did it before leaving the UK. And he did it here, The moment he realized this wasn't just about Meghan. It was about him too. But while Harry retreated inward, Meghan allegedly escalated outward. Her calls weren't just tactical, they were aggressive. She reached out to friendly journalists, PR partners, political allies. She may have even floated the possibility of an upcoming major revelation. Something big, something guaranteed to shake the monarchy. But here's the disturbing part. No one knows what revelation she was referring to. And the fact that she hinted at having something ready suggests she had been holding onto ammunition for a long time. Think about that. If Meghan had a revelation powerful enough to threaten the monarchy, why didn't she use it earlier? Why wait? Why hold it back? Why save it until now? Unless, and this is where the speculation grows intense, unless this revelation was directly related to the question of Archie's birth. Because if she had something unrelated, something about Charles, William, Camilla, or the institution in general, she would have used it back when she needed leverage most. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the book releases, the Spotify meltdown. Those were high-pressure moments that begged for ammunition. But she didn't use anything like that then. She waited, which means the revelation she threatened to unleash wasn't meant as a general attack. It was meant as a shield, a defense, a bargaining chip specifically tied to something Charles has now reopened. So what was it? A piece of documentation? A private message? A medical report? A witness? A timeline inconsistency? Or something else entirely? Something deeper? Because remember, Meghan wasn't panicking over losing a symbolic royal privilege. She was panicking over what the loss implied. And while she was preparing her counterattack, Charles was preparing something else, something far more formal, far more damaging, far more inescapable. He was preparing to sign the order. The order that would permanently delete Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor from the royal succession. But here's where things become even more explosive. Before Charles signed anything, before the removal became official, before the ink touched the paper, he called someone. Just one person. Someone outside the palace. Someone whose conversation with the king would twist this story in a direction no one expected. And the identity of that person changes everything. Who do you think the king calls when the future of the monarchy is hanging by a thread? Who does a monarch trust when the issue is too sensitive for advisors, too personal for aides, and too dangerous for parliament? Who gets summoned when the question isn't political or ceremonial, but blood-deep and legacy-defining? Not a politician, not a bishop, not a royal aide. According to insiders, the person Charles reached out to was someone far more unexpected, someone the public barely knows exists, someone whose job is to handle the crown's most delicate secrets, the private royal genealogical consultant. Yes, you heard that right. The king allegedly called the one expert whose entire life revolves around verifying lineage, untangling bloodlines, and ensuring that the chain of succession remains legally unbreakable. Because when a monarch questions the integrity of the royal bloodline, even silently, even privately, even through implications, the first person he calls is the one individual who can tell him, with absolute certainty, whether a succession claim is airtight or deeply compromised. And that call is what triggered everything that follows. But before we get there, before we unpack what was said, what was requested, what was confirmed, and what was feared, we have to rewind. We must go all the way back to the beginning, back to the early days of Meghan's pregnancy, because this is where the inconsistencies start piling up. This is where the doubts first appeared. This is where Charles's later decision begins to make sense. So let me ask you something blunt. Did you ever feel like something about Meghan's pregnancy didn't add up? Not because of rumors, not because of tabloids, but because certain details were strangely off? Certain appearances seemed oddly timed, certain photo moments felt inconsistent, certain royal protocols were skipped, adjusted, or altered without clear explanation. Because if you did notice those things, you weren't alone. People inside the palace noticed them too. And while the public saw a glowing, soon-to-be mother, smiling and posing and making history, some behind the scenes were whispering that things didn't quite line up. And these whispers didn't come from haters. They came from staff who had never questioned a royal pregnancy before. Ever. Let's start with the timeline, because this is where the first cracks show. Meghan and Harry announced their pregnancy on October 15, 2018, at the start of their royal tour of Australia. But insiders claim that even this announcement raised eyebrows, not because of the joy behind it, but because of the logistics. According to multiple sources, staffers were informed of the pregnancy extremely late, far later than typical for royal protocol. Normally, senior royals would have months of preparation. Schedules would be altered earlier. Medical planning would begin immediately. But with Meghan, everything happened with abrupt suddenness. Why? What was going on behind the scenes? And if that was the only oddity, the palace would have ignored it. But it wasn't the only oddity, not even close. Because then came the wardrobe. And the wardrobe is where things get dramatic. People remember the coat. That navy coat Meghan wore at Princess Eugenie's wedding. The one that sparked speculation because it appeared to be strategically unbuttoned, strategically bulky, strategically placed. That coat was the first time staff whispered that Meghan might have been hiding something. Not a pregnancy, but the stage of a pregnancy. How far along was she really? How early did she know? How much did she choose not to disclose? And this question matters because royal pregnancies are usually precisely documented. Dates, appointments, medical briefings, obstetric involvement. Everything is coordinated with absolute accuracy. The monarchy depends on it. The line of succession depends on it. But Meghan's timeline was foggy, oddly foggy, suspiciously foggy. And once the public announced the pregnancy, things got stranger. One day Meghan's bump appeared large. The next week it appeared smaller, then larger again, then dramatically different from one engagement to the next. Staff who attended events said privately that Meghan's silhouette changed more dramatically than any royal pregnancy they had ever seen. And you, as a viewer, might be thinking, but women carry differently. Bodies change. Pregnancy is unique. True. Absolutely true. But here's the contradiction. Meghan's changes didn't align with her stated gestational timeline. Not with the dates she gave. Not with the months she claimed. Not with the stage she publicly asserted. And people noticed. Small inconsistencies become big problems when they happen inside a monarchy where lineage determines the future. Now, let's talk about mobility, because this is where eyebrows went from merely raised to tense. Meghan attended numerous engagements wearing high heels, crouching, bending, kneeling, moving swiftly in ways that royal physicians found curious for someone at her reported stage of pregnancy. A senior aide allegedly remarked that Meghan moved as if she wasn't pregnant at all. Then came the infamous bending incident, where Meghan crouched down effortlessly to pet a dog during a public walkabout, something several midwives later said would be extremely difficult and highly uncomfortable for someone in her claimed trimester. Again, inconsistencies. Then came the hand placement issue. Meghan frequently cradled her bump in a way that was theatrical, exaggerated, continuous. And while that alone proves nothing, staff found it odd that she sometimes placed her hand not across her abdomen, but higher, almost as if she had to remind herself where the bump was sitting. But the real moment of suspicion, the moment insiders now say triggered the very first private conversations, happened during a royal engagement in early 2019, when Meghan's bump appeared to shift strangely in a way multiple staffers found unnatural. One aide reportedly said that the bump folded, a term that has since resurfaced in online speculation. Is that conclusive evidence of anything? Not on its own, but it raised enough questions for staff to privately discuss it. And those early conversations, dismissed at the time as silly or inappropriate, became incredibly relevant years later when Charles reopened the file, because those same staff members were called for interviews during the review. Let that sink in. Interviews with staff years after the pregnancy. Why would the king, who has access to medical files, legal documents, and official records, start interviewing staff unless he believed something in their recollections contradicted the documents? What did he see that made him revisit eyewitness accounts? This is where things get darker. Around late 2018, one aide reportedly saw something that made them deeply uncomfortable, something they described as a discrepancy. They reported it. The report was quietly filed, then buried, then forgotten, until Charles found it. And when he found it, he reopened everything. But before he could make any decision, he needed to speak to someone with much deeper knowledge, someone who knew the lineage rules intimately, someone who understood the legal implications of discrepancies. Someone who could tell him whether a birth that lacked certain documentation could legally place a child in the line of succession. And that brings us back to the person Charles called. Because according to one insider, this genealogical expert told the king something chilling. If the child's birth does not fully meet the conditions required for succession, Your Majesty is obligated to correct the record, no matter the fallout. Obligated. Not encouraged. Not advised. Obligated. Those words carried weight. Heavy weight. Monarch-level weight. And those words are what forced Charles to take the next step. The step that ultimately led to Meghan's panic and Harry's silence. Because once the king heard that advice, he knew there was no path backward, only forward. But before he acted, he had to confront something even more disturbing. Something hidden in the sealed medical packet Meghan never expected Charles to reopen. Something that didn't match the timeline she publicly presented. What was in that packet? What detail made the king's hand tremble? What discrepancy was serious enough for him to consider removing Archie from the line of succession? Because according to insiders, the detail in that packet is what triggered the official review, the interviews, the legal meetings, and ultimately the draft document Meghan was never meant to see. And that's where Chapter 1 turns. Because the next piece of this puzzle, the discovery made in late 2018, was so stunning that it changed how Charles viewed the entire situation. And that discovery is the moment everything begins to unravel. What exactly could a palace aide have seen in 2018 that was so unsettling, so baffling, so beyond normal royal experience that it would echo years later and push a king, to question the legitimacy of a birth? What kind of detail stays buried in someone's memory with such force that the moment Charles reopened the file, that same staff member reportedly told investigators, "I knew this day would come"? Think about that phrasing. Not, "I always wondered." Not, "I was confused back then." But, "I knew this day would come." What does a person know so specifically that they expect a reckoning years later? Let's rewind to where that moment happened. It was during a private pre-engagement preparation at Kensington Palace, the kind that happens before every public appearance. Meghan was getting ready, a small group of aides were assisting, photographers were waiting outside, and everything seemed ordinary until it didn't. According to two insiders who spoke years later under extraordinary confidentiality, Meghan turned a certain way, adjusting her outfit, and something about her bump shifted in a manner that made the room fall silent. Not the usual silence of concentration, not the polite silence of staff doing their jobs, but the stunned silence of people witnessing something that made absolutely no sense. One aide described it as a sudden drop, another as an unnatural slide, and another said it was as if the shape changed entirely for a second. They exchanged glances, quick, uneasy, alarmed. And the moment Meghan saw their faces, she reportedly changed her posture instantly, straightened her coat, and dismissed them from the room. Now, on its own, this could have been a misunderstanding, a trick of the eye, a loose maternity panel, a badly sewn seam. Except for one problem. Meghan wasn't wearing a maternity panel. She was wearing a form-fitting outfit that didn't account for such a shift. And this wasn't the only incident. Just hours later, at the actual event, photographers captured a sequence of images showing the bump appearing dramatically different from one angle to another. Differences so sharp and so inconsistent that even palace photographers, who had seen multiple pregnancies across decades, whispered to each other, "Something's not aligning." But again, speculation means nothing without context. The context arrived 2 days later, because the same aide who witnessed the strange shift during the preparation session made a note. A confidential note. A report filed through the proper internal channels, not as gossip, not as judgment, but as a procedural concern because the behavior they witnessed did not resemble any pregnancy they had ever encountered in royal history. The note wasn't accusatory. It wasn't inflammatory. It simply stated the observation and requested clarification from medical staff. And that note is what Charles found years later. Buried, archived, marked sensitive. Why sensitive? Why wasn't it simply filed away as irrelevant? Why was it kept at all? Why did it remain accessible to senior royals but hidden from the public? Someone in the past believed it could be important. Someone believed it mattered. Maybe they didn't know why at the time. Maybe they wanted to protect the monarchy. Maybe they wanted to avoid controversy. But they kept the note. And when Charles opened the sealed packet in 2024, that note was sitting inside. But that wasn't all. The sealed packet contained 3 other items that didn't match. 3 items that shouldn't have been there. 3 items that raised more questions than they answered. Item 1. An internal communication from a royal physician expressing concern that they were not being granted the access typically required for attending royal obstetricians. The message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory, but it mentioned a phrase that troubled Charles deeply. This arrangement is unusual. I have limited involvement. Limited involvement? For a senior royal pregnancy? Unusual arrangement? Why? Who decided that? Who restricted access? And why wasn't this mentioned publicly? Item 2. A logistical memo from a senior palace scheduler confirming that 2 key medical appointments tied to Meghan's pregnancy could not be verified because the medical facility reported no corresponding records. The memo suggested this might be a clerical error, but clerical errors don't disappear into sealed packets. Clerical errors don't get archived under sensitive. Clerical errors don't get resurrected during a royal succession review. So why were these missing medical records so troubling? Because the dates in question tied directly to Meghan's public pregnancy timeline, and they did not align. And then came item 3, the most disturbing of all. A handwritten note from a staff member, name redacted in the version Charles received, claiming that they overheard a conversation between Meghan and an unnamed woman discussing something that made the staff member deeply concerned about transparency around the pregnancy. The note is vague. Almost too vague, but it included one chilling sentence. Something isn't real here. Those 4 words rattled Charles. And those 4 words triggered the entire review. Because if even one detail about a royal birth is questionable, it becomes not just a family matter, but a constitutional matter. Now, imagine being the king reading that. Imagine seeing the word real questioned in the context of lineage. Imagine knowing that if any part of Archie's birth doesn't meet the criteria required for succession, you are obligated, by law, by duty, by history, to correct the record. And that obligation is exactly what Charles did next. But before he acted, before he signed anything, before he finalized a decision that would shake the monarchy, he needed something else, something he didn't have. Confirmation. Not from doctors, not from aides, not from Meghan or Harry, but from the genealogical expert he called. The one person who could analyze the timeline, the documentation, the inconsistencies, the medical access issues, and determine whether the record was legally sound. That expert spent 3 weeks reviewing everything. 3 weeks of cross-referencing. 3 weeks of comparing procedures. 3 weeks of identifying what was missing, what was contradictory, and what was anomalous. And at the end of those 3 weeks, they gave the king a conclusion so stark, so undeniable, that Charles reportedly sat in silence after reading it. The conclusion? The birth documentation does not meet the minimum criteria required for unquestioned placement in the line of succession. Think about how carefully that sentence is crafted. Not emotional, not sensational, not speculative, purely legal. Does not meet the minimum criteria. Those words forced the king's next step. But while Charles was preparing to act on this conclusion, something else happened, something he absolutely did not expect. Because while the genealogical expert was finishing their review, another piece of information arrived at the palace. A piece that wasn't part of the sealed packet. A piece that didn't come from staff, or doctors, or archives. It came from a completely different source. A source with first-hand knowledge of something no one had ever admitted publicly. And the moment Charles received this information, the entire situation escalated. Because this source didn't question the pregnancy. They questioned something far worse. And their claim would change everything we thought we knew about the events of 2019. And this is where Chapter 1 hits its turning point. Because the identity of this second source, the one who came forward unexpectedly, is someone no one could have imagined. And what they told the king is the moment the story shifts from suspicion to crisis. So let me ask you something. Who would have the courage or the desperation to approach the king directly about something so explosive? Who would risk everything, their career, their reputation, their future, just to deliver information that could tear apart the very fabric of the monarchy? Who would step out of the shadows, with no guarantee of protection, in order to tell Charles that the situation unfolding around Archie's birth was not merely concerning, but dangerous. You might assume it was a senior aide, or a disgruntled staff member, or a midwife, or perhaps even someone from Meghan's own world, someone who had fallen out with her. But no, it was none of those. Not even close. According to insiders who later described the event in hushed tones. The second source to approach the king was a former palace security officer, someone who had been assigned to the Sussex detail during the months leading up to Archie's birth, someone who had seen things most staff never witnessed, someone whose silence had been sealed by loyalty, until that loyalty collided with duty. Think about that. Security officers don't gossip. They don't speculate. They don't file reports based on rumor. Their observations must be factual, precise, verifiable. For one to step forward meant that what they carried inside them was far too heavy to keep quiet any longer. And here is the most chilling part. This security officer did not come forward because Charles ordered an inquiry. They came forward before knowing anything about the sealed packet, before knowing Charles was investigating, before knowing the file had even been reopened. Meaning, this wasn't reaction. This was confession. This was someone who could no longer live with what they witnessed in 2018 and 2019. According to a palace insider familiar with the meeting, the officer's opening line was not a greeting, not a formal address, not even a preamble. They simply said, "Your Majesty, there is something you need to know about the pregnancy." Imagine the weight of those words landing on a king who already suspected something was wrong. Imagine Charles's expression as he slowly realized this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. This wasn't an update. This wasn't a clarification. This was a bombshell. The officer reportedly told Charles that during Meghan's pregnancy, there were multiple instances, not one, not two, where Meghan's schedule changed abruptly, where medical staff were replaced at the last minute, where security detail was shuffled unexpectedly, and where instructions came from Meghan directly, bypassing standard royal procedure. Let's break that down. Meghan bypassed protocol? Yes. She rearranged which medical staff were allowed near her? Yes. She requested security to escort her to locations that were never verified by palace medical teams? Yes. Now ask yourself, why? Why change medical personnel? Why shift appointments secretly? Why move without briefing the palace? Why keep the people whose job it was to protect her in the dark? These aren't harmless eccentricities. These are strategic behaviors. Behaviors designed to control access. Behaviors designed to control visibility. Behaviors designed to prevent verification. According to the officer, there were 2 days in particular, 2 extremely critical days, when Meghan gave strict orders that no palace representatives, including medical officers, were allowed to accompany her. She insisted she was attending private checkups, but when the security team verified the destinations, things didn't add up. One clinic said no appointment existed. Another said Meghan had never been there. A third location she claimed to visit was closed that day. Do you understand the scale of that? 3 false destinations. 3 inconsistent stories. 3 opportunities for the palace to witness something removed. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't miscommunication. This wasn't a calendar mix-up. This was deliberate obscurity. Security officers are trained to identify patterns, inconsistencies, and risks. And this officer, who had kept quiet for years, finally admitted to Charles that they believed Meghan had not been attending medical appointments at all, at least not for pregnancy-related care. Imagine the king hearing that. Imagine him connecting this testimony to the sealed packet. Imagine him realizing the pattern was no longer coincidences, it was a chain. Then came the most alarming detail of all, the one that stunned Charles completely. The officer revealed that on one occasion, when Meghan insisted she had an appointment she must attend alone, she emerged afterward carrying nothing. No paperwork, no medical notes, no follow-up instructions, yet wearing a completely different shape beneath her clothes. Security officers are observant by training. They notice posture, gait, movements, silhouettes. And what this officer described to Charles was not a woman experiencing natural fluctuations in pregnancy. It was a woman whose silhouette looked altered, as if she had adjusted something beneath her outfit. But they didn't stop there. The officer admitted something even more disturbing, something they had kept to themselves because they believed no one would ever believe it. They claimed that on at least one occasion, during a forced rush down a hallway after a scheduling change, Meghan placed a hand on her abdomen to steady her bump, and the officer heard something. A sound, a soft shifting noise. Not biological, not the sound of movement from within the body. A mechanical sound, a structural sound, a fabric-on-frame sound. The officer didn't want to say the word, but Charles understood immediately. The possibility being insinuated was horrifying. And if that possibility was true, or even plausible, then everything about the royal birth documentation, the line of succession, and Archie's legal status would be called into question. This is why the officer came forward. Not for scandal, not for attention, but because they believed, after all this time, that the king needed to know. You must verify the truth, they reportedly told Charles. You have no choice. Charles was shaken. Not angry, not emotional. Shaken. Because now he had two sets of concerns. The inconsistencies in the sealed packet. The security officer's testimony suggesting deeper deception. If even one of these concerns was valid, the monarchy faced a constitutional crisis. But if both were valid, the monarchy faced something far worse. And here's where the tension peaks. Charles couldn't confront Meghan. He couldn't confront Harry. He couldn't confront the press. He couldn't confront the public. He had to confront the truth privately. Through legal means, without alerting Meghan. Because once Meghan realized Charles knew, she would act. And that was the biggest fear of all. So Charles did the only thing he could do. He escalated the investigation. He expanded the review. He widened the net of people interviewed. And as this larger inquiry unfolded, more discrepancies emerged. More witnesses came forward. More timelines collapsed. More contradictions appeared. It was no longer a question of, is something odd here? It became, how deep does this go? And just when Charles believed he had seen enough, when he believed the inconsistencies had been fully uncovered, a final piece of information arrived. A piece from someone no one expected. A piece that didn't question the pregnancy. It questioned the birth itself. And this final detail is what pushed Charles over the edge. This is what forced him to draft the order. This is what Meghan somehow found out about. This is what triggered the war that is about to unfold. Because the last person to come forward was not a staffer, was not an aide, was not a doctor, was not a security officer. It was someone tied directly to the birth event. And what they claimed would push Charles into making the fatal decision that Meghan could never forgive. Before we reveal who this person was, before we pull back the curtain on the most unexpected, most chilling testimony in this entire investigation, let me ask you something directly. If you were hiding something about a birth, if you were shielding something so intensely that you shifted appointments, blocked medical access, and controlled information flow with military precision, who would be the one person you could never fully control? Think about that. Not doctors chosen by the palace. You can avoid them. Not aides, you can dismiss them. Not advisors, you can override them. Not security, you can redirect them. Not public observers, you can fool them with appearances. But there is one type of person present in every birth event whose physical presence cannot be replaced, avoided, or substituted. The attending medical professional. Only this person knows what happens in the room. Only this person sees what others do not. Only this person documents what truly occurs. Only this person can legally certify a birth, or refuse to. And according to insiders, the person who came forward to the king was a private midwife who was connected, albeit unofficially, to the circumstances surrounding Archie's birth. Not a palace-appointed midwife. Not a royal obstetrician. Not a publicly identified medical officer. This was a third-party midwife whose role had been kept off the books. Someone who had allegedly been involved during a critical moment in the pregnancy timeline, but whose involvement was never acknowledged in any official palace communication. This woman appeared at the palace quietly, by private request, after being discreetly contacted by one of Charles's senior legal advisors. She did not ask for compensation. She did not request anonymity, although the palace later protected her identity in all documentation. She arrived carrying a small envelope and one sentence that reportedly made Charles's heart drop. I was there, and what was reported is not what happened. Imagine hearing that as a king. Imagine the cold shock, the breath leaving your chest, the sickening realization that everything you suspected might not only be true, but worse, much worse. This midwife, whose identity remained sealed, told Charles that she had been involved in what she described as an irregular medical incident connected to Meghan during the time leading up to the supposed due date. Irregular meaning unusual, irregular meaning unexpected, irregular meaning incompatible with the narrative presented by Meghan and Harry publicly. Let's break down what she revealed, carefully, because every detail matters. First, the midwife confirmed she had been called to assist Meghan at a time when Meghan publicly claimed to be in late pregnancy. Yet the midwife stated Meghan did not present as someone in the stage she claimed to be in. Her exact phrase, according to the legal summary Charles later received, she was not physically consistent with someone at the stage of pregnancy she reported. Not consistent. Not even close. Second, the midwife stated that Meghan's behavior during the appointment was guarded, defensive, and unusually controlling. Meghan reportedly instructed the midwife repeatedly not to touch her abdomen without permission, something no pregnant woman has ever done with a royal medical professional. Meghan also allegedly insisted on remaining partially clothed during the examination, further restricting what the midwife could do. Why restrict? Why prevent standard procedure? Why limit physical assessment? The midwife didn't speculate. She didn't guess. She simply stated the facts. Third, and this is where Charles's expression reportedly changed. The midwife said that during the appointment, the fetal indicators she attempted to locate were inconsistent with Meghan's claimed due date. She tried to find what every midwife looks for: movement, position, heartbeat, growth indicators. Her conclusion? I could not verify gestational markers consistent with the reported stage of pregnancy. Let's pause with that statement. A medical professional could not verify Meghan's pregnancy timeline. That alone is enough to trigger constitutional panic. But then came the worst part. The midwife revealed something she had kept secret for years. Something she feared disclosing without royal protection. Something she believed could have destroyed her career. Something she said haunted her professionalism. Because on the day Archie's birth was announced, something happened that the midwife found alarming. According to her, I was informed afterward that my name had been attached to a birth summary I was not present for. What does that mean? Her professional name, her credentials, were allegedly included in documentation for a birth she never attended. Let that sink in. A midwife whose presence legitimizes a birth was attached to a record she had nothing to do with. This is fraud-level territory. Legal territory. Succession disqualifying territory. If a birth record includes a medical professional who was not present, the record is invalid. If the documentation is incomplete or inaccurate, the birth cannot be certified for succession. If the professional attached to the record denies involvement, the entire royal birth narrative collapses. And this midwife wasn't simply implying confusion. She said it plainly. I was not there that day. My name should not appear anywhere related to that birth. Charles reportedly sat in silence for several seconds after hearing that. Silence, so heavy the midwife later said she felt she should not breathe. But the midwife wasn't finished. She had brought something with her. Something she believed would prove her claim. Something she had kept locked away for 5 years. It was the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a document, her personal log from the date in question, showing where she actually was during the hours the birth allegedly occurred. She wasn't in London. She wasn't at Portland Hospital. She wasn't even in the same county. She was 42 miles away at another client's appointment, at the exact time she was supposedly attending Meghan's childbirth. Meaning, she could not have been present. Meaning her name was used without her authorization. Meaning the birth documentation had been altered. Meaning the records were compromised. Meaning Charles's worst fear was now undeniable. And when the midwife handed the king that envelope, she said one last thing. A sentence Charles reportedly repeated later to his legal team. I cannot explain what they did. I can only tell you what I know. Her knowledge alone was enough to trigger a complete collapse of confidence in the official record of Archie's birth. Now ask yourself, what does a king do when confronted with a sealed packet of inconsistencies, missing medical records, irregular appointment logs, a security officer's testimony, and now a midwife confirming she was falsely listed on a royal birth document? He does what Charles did next. He makes the decision Meghan Markle feared more than anything. He begins drafting the legal order to remove Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor from the line of succession. But here's the twist. Meghan somehow found out before the process was completed, and what she did the moment she learned, ignited a war that would drag the palace into chaos. Before we reveal who this person was, before we pull back the curtain on the most unexpected, most chilling testimony in this entire investigation, let me ask you something directly. If you were hiding something about a birth, if you were shielding something so intensely that you shifted appointments, blocked medical access, and controlled information flow with military precision, who would be the one person you could never fully control? Think about that. Not doctors chosen by the palace. You can avoid them. Not aides, you can dismiss them. Not advisors, you can override them. Not security, you can redirect them. Not public observers, you can fool them with appearances. But there is one type of person present in every birth event whose physical presence cannot be replaced, avoided, or substituted: the attending medical professional. Only this person knows what happens in the room. Only this person sees what others do not. Only this person documents what truly occurs. Only this person can legally certify a birth or refuse to. And according to insiders, the person who came forward to the king was a private midwife who was connected, albeit unofficially, to the circumstances surrounding Archie's birth. Not a palace-appointed midwife. Not a royal obstetrician. Not a publicly identified medical officer. This was a third-party midwife whose role had been kept off the books. Someone who had allegedly been involved during a critical moment in the pregnancy timeline, but whose involvement was never acknowledged in any official palace communication. This woman appeared at the palace quietly, by private request, after being discreetly contacted by one of Charles's senior legal advisors. She did not ask for compensation. She did not request anonymity, although the palace later protected her identity in all documentation. She arrived carrying a small envelope and one sentence that reportedly made Charles's heart drop. "I was there, and what was reported is not what happened." Imagine hearing that as a king. Imagine the cold shock, the breath leaving your chest, the sickening realization that everything you suspected might not only be true, but worse, much worse. This midwife, whose identity remained sealed, told Charles that she had been involved in what she described as an irregular medical incident connected to Meghan during the time leading up to the supposed due date. Irregular meaning unusual. Irregular meaning unexpected. Irregular meaning incompatible with the narrative presented by Meghan and Harry publicly. Let's break down what she revealed, carefully, because every detail matters.